Pete. And when we meet Pete, he was sitting by a lakeside, and he was a bit down and a bit confused and didn't really know what to do. Because Pete's friend, Jesus, had died. Just about 2 weeks previously, Pete had met Jesus, and he spent 3 years with him. And Pete thought Jesus was great. He thought he was the most amazing man he'd ever met. And more than that, Pete thought Jesus was going to sort out all the problems of the world. But 2 weeks ago, it all went wrong. Jesus was taken by the religious authorities. He was handed over to the Romans, and he was killed. He was crucified, hung up on the cross. And what made it even worse was that Pete had let Jesus down. He'd sort of followed along when Jesus was taken to his trial, and he was kind of standing by to see what would happen. He was very afraid because he thought he might be taken as well. And when somebody said to him, "You know this man, don't you?" He said, "No, I don't know him. Never seen him before." And then somebody else said, "Well, look, you've got the same accent as him. You both got northern accents. You must be the same." He said, No, never seen him before." And another time, somebody again said, "Well, no, you must have been with the..." No, I've never heard of the man." And just as Pete said that, Jesus looked at him. He turned around and looked at him, and Pete felt so bad. He could have crawled into a hole and died. And he went out and cried, because Pete knew that he'd let Jesus down badly. And Jesus was crucified. They didn't know what was going to happen. It was the end of the world. Not only had Jesus died, but Pete had let him down. But 3 days later, an amazing thing happened because Jesus reappeared. And it wasn't just in their minds, it wasn't just a thought, it was really Jesus. He came and he spent time with them. He even had a meal with them. But it was strange because sometimes Jesus appeared and he disappeared again. It wasn't like it used to be. Things were very strange and different. And so Pete and his friends didn't know what to do, so they went back home, which is one of the things you do when you don't know what to do, isn't it? You go home. And so they went back to the Lake Galilee, where they used to live, because Pete, you see, he'd been a fisherman. He was a big, strong chap, and he was really good at being a fisherman. He could pull the nets in, and he could pull the boats up onto the beach. And he reckoned he was the best fisherman on Lake Galilee. So they went back to Galilee, and they were sitting around one day, and they didn't know quite what to do. They were confused. Jesus seemed to be alive, but he appeared and disappeared. They didn't know what they were supposed to do. So Pete was sitting there looking around, and he says, "I'm going to go fishing." And so the other chaps around him, his friends said, "Oh, all right, we'll come fishing too. We'll come with you." And so Pete and his friend Tom and Nate and Jim and John and some other people, they all went fishing out in the boat. And they were fishing not with rods, but with nets. And so, anybody here go fishing? Any fishermen here? No, nobody goes fishing, no. I've been fishing once or twice, usually with rods, and you throw out the rod and you hope you're going to catch something. Well, they threw out their nets and pulled them in, nothing. And they did it again on the other side of the boat, pulled them in, nothing, no fish. And they did this all night. Fished all night, and not a solitary minnow did they catch. Nothing at all, no fish. So that by the time it was starting to get light, they were getting pretty fed up. And they could see just in the dawn light, they could see somebody standing on the shore. Some bloke standing watching them. And this random bloke on the shore shouts out to them, "Hey guys, have you got any fish?" What's he wanting? Fish. "No, we haven't got any fish." Busybody on the beach. throw your net on the right side of the boat. What's he think he's telling us to throw it? We've been fishing all night. We're the fishermen. What? Throw your net on the right side of the boat. Well, I suppose we might as well try. So they threw the net out on the right side of the boat, and wow, they couldn't pull all the fish in. They caught so many fish, they just couldn't even pull them in onto the boat. John said to Pete, "That's Jesus." Because it had happened before, he remembered. That's Jesus. Pete was so excited, he jumped in the water and he swam all the way to the shore. He wasn't a very good swimmer, but he sort of doggy paddled all his way to the shore and ran up onto the beach. And sure enough, it was Jesus. And Pete gave him a big wet hug. And they all both got wet. And Jesus was laughing at him. He says, "You're so excited, Pete." And the other guys had been bringing the boat up. They'd rowed up, towing the net with all the fish in it. And so Pete says, "Well, look, we'd better see how many fish there are." And so he's so excited, he was counting all the fish. 20, 30, 40, 100, 153 fish. This was more fish than Pete had ever caught in his life. All his life as a fisherman. This was the best catch he'd ever had. And Jesus was standing there laughing because Pete and the others were so excited. Jesus was smiling and laughing at them, at their excitement. He said, "Come on, let's have some breakfast, guys." And Jesus had prepared a barbecue. And he had some fish and some bread. And so he gave them some fish and some bread. And they had a lovely breakfast. And what an amazing thing that was, to be sitting there by the lake with Jesus, who they thought had died and had come back to life again. And now Jesus did an amazing thing. He took Pete for a walk, because Pete was still feeling a bit bad about having let Jesus down. He didn't know if things were all right between him and Jesus still. And so as they were walking along the beach, Jesus said to Pete, "Pete, do you love me?" Pete said, "Yes, I love you." So they walked a little bit further. "Pete, do you love me?" "Yes, I love you." Walked a little bit further. "Pete, do you love me?" And at this stage, Peter was getting a bit upset. He was thinking, well, Jesus, he's maybe thinking about that time I let him down. And he's wondering if I really love him. He said, "Look, Jesus, you know everything. You know I love you." And Jesus just nodded. He said, I know you love me. He said, "But I want you to do something." He says, "I want you to go and feed my sheep." Now, that was a strange thing to ask Pete, the fisherman, to do, wasn't it? Go and feed sheep. But Jesus didn't mean it literally. He didn't have a flock of sheep somewhere. What he wanted Pete to do was to go and be what we now call a pastor. In other words, to look after people and tell them about Jesus. And so Pete, having been restored by Jesus and forgiven for all his mistakes, was then given a job to do. He was to go and be a pastor and look after people and tell them about Jesus. And later on, towards the end of his life, Pete wrote a letter to his friends. And he said this, "To the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder and a witness of Christ's sufferings, who also will share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care." Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care. That's what a pastor does. "Not because you must, but because you are willing, as God wants you to be. Not pursuing dishonest gain, but eager to serve. Not lording it over those who entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock." And that's the sort of pastor that Pete had been. And he says this, "When the chief shepherd," that's Jesus, "appears, you'll receive the crown of glory that will never fade away." So that's the story of Pete. Now, I want you to just think about that and think about, as you were listening to that story again, you maybe recognize the story, you've probably heard it before lots of times. What do you think about Pete as you hear that story? Anybody got any thoughts about Pete? What's your What strikes you about Pete as you listen to that story? Anybody got any thoughts about Pete? What was he like? No, you're all going to sleep. Andrew, what were you thinking about Pete in that story?
So Pete thought that he had really let Jesus down and that he was beyond redemption, and yet Jesus still restored him and redeemed him.
Yeah.
And I suppose the same for us, really. We're not beyond redemption. Jesus can still redeem and restore us.
Wonderful, yeah. I wonder if you've ever thought, how did people know about Pete letting Jesus down? Because it's in all 4 Gospels. How did they know? How did they know that it happened? Because Pete was on his own at the time, as far as we can tell. I think he must have told everybody. He must have fessed up, look, I let Jesus down. And I bet he told them that lots of times, because it's important to recognize, isn't it? Important for us to be honest about our own failures. And so Pete, I'm sure, was honest about his failures and about the fact that Jesus forgave him. What do you think about Jesus from that story? Anybody got anything struck you about Jesus in the story? What do you think about Jesus?
I think the fact that Peter didn't need to go looking for Jesus, but Jesus was there, just waiting for him on the beach, which I think is a good picture for us, really. Jesus is a bit like this parable of the prodigal son. The Father's waiting to restore us and to bring us back.
Yeah, wonderful, isn't it? That Jesus was just there. Yeah. Anything else about Jesus anybody noticed in the story? Say again.
I said that Jesus loves us even though we let him down.
Yes, that's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah, because we all do it. We all do it. We all let him down. We've all denied him sometimes. We've all done things that we shouldn't have done. Anybody else?
When he restored Peter, he did it in a very kind and gentle way. He didn't tell him off.
Yeah.
He just was very definite in the way that he encouraged him. And I thought that was quite amazing, really.
Yeah. I love the wonderful practicalness about Jesus' care. He made breakfast for them. Yeah? Made breakfast for them and served them breakfast. What a wonderful, humble thing to do for someone who'd just been through what Jesus had been through and who, he now conquered death. He's the King of Kings. And he made breakfast for his friends on the beach. What a wonderful person Jesus is. So as we think about that story about Pete, and as we go forward into the new year, I just want us to just spend a few minutes now reflecting on that, reflecting about the forgiveness that's available to each one of us. Although Peter had let Jesus down, he was able to be forgiven and restored. Reflecting on Jesus, and we've been singing about how Jesus is the king, but he's not a remote king. He's a king who's prepared to serve his friends breakfast on the beach. Thinking about the way forward, and so having been restored to friendship with Jesus, having had his failures forgiven, Pete is now given a job to do. So he doesn't just sit back, he doesn't just go fishing again, he doesn't become a fisherman again, but he's now given a new job to do as a pastor for God's people. Maybe reflect on what God has got in store for you to do as we go into a new year. Let's just spend a few minutes thinking silently about that. And then in a few minutes we're going to sing again, and then we're going to share in communion together. Just a few minutes silence as we reflect on the story, reflect on how Jesus might be speaking to us, reflect on what role God has got for us over the coming year.